All right, what's going on, guys? So today I'm really excited because we're sitting down with the hypertrophy coach, Joe Bennet, and we're going to be talking about hypertrophy training and misconceptions and just covering quite a broad spectrum of questions that I get on a regular basis. So first off, Joe, thanks so much for jumping on, man. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Happy to be here.
Would you be able to just give a little bit of an introduction and history of yourself for those who maybe aren't familiar with you and your work?
Yeah, for sure. Always feel weird saying this telling my little bio. Try to keep it as short as possible. But I mean, honestly, as far as where I'm at now and where I started, I honestly first got into it a little bit from playing sports. So I got into training the same as a lot of people. My dad would take me to the gym every once in a while. I had the bench press in the garage deal. I don't know when that happened sporadically, age 10 to 14, something like that. And then probably when I was 14, 15, my brother had the Arnold Encyclopedia of Modern Bodybuilding. And I remember the first time like looking at that, being like, oh shit, like people look like this. And it's the cliche thing, but something was like, okay, like I want to do that. And I'm naturally like my whole, everyone kind of says this, but if you look at my entire family and everything, I'm naturally kind of like lanky. I got like long arms, kind of like a smaller rib cage. Like I'm really good at endurance sports. And something clicked with me too, because I just like to do things that I'm not naturally good at. And so in high school, I literally just went like I think my entire family thought I had mental problems. Like I literally would just, spend all my money on magazines. I'd read everything I could online. At some point in time during high school, I was training like 3 times a day just because I thought training was all you were supposed to do. And I liked it. So I would literally train during school, after school, and another gym membership I had at night. Didn't know anything about recovery, didn't know anything about eating just because I didn't really care about that at the point in time. And I used to bring like dumbbells and shit on vacations and stuff. And it was pretty entertaining in retrospect, looking at all the stereotypical, ridiculous meathead stuff I did. And then in college, I was pre-physical therapy for a little bit because I kind of had the idea I wanted to do something in the physical realm. That's the first time I like figured out, okay, like eating's important, sleep's important, tone down my training to 2-a-days. But still like anyone that knew me in college was just like, I had 2 things. I had like bodybuilding stuff on one side of the wall and then like Lord of the Rings stuff on the other side of the wall. So I always say both of those are very popular with ladies. I don't know how I ended up with my wife during college. Somehow she didn't get turned off by that. And, but that was when I got my first job at a gym as well too, up at school. And at some point in time, I think by my 3rd year, I switched from pre-physical therapy to like an exercise science degree. Still don't really know exactly what I wanted to do, but that degree had the word exercise in it and science, which I think if we combine the two, maybe I'll have an actual job coming out of college. And so worked at a gym up there, got around some really good people. That's the first time I realized like the benefit of getting outside of just, like your curriculum, what you're learning, obviously in your classes and stuff, and getting around some people that were on like the rec strength and conditioning side. That's when I actually started personal training for the first time, training just college population. And so I honestly did it because I just kind of liked it, but I didn't think you could make a living at being a trainer because I just had the same perception of trainers that everybody did. And honestly, still like early 2000s, I don't know. It still wasn't quite, it's definitely not like it is now. And even then it was still kind of like, I don't really know if you can make a living at this type deal. So I basically got into corporate wellness right outside of college and hated that. I had somebody give me a business card and say, hey, if you're interested in training, come hit me up or whatever. And really, really lucky. My wife had gotten a job in the area we were at. And then I started working for like a big box gym, just thinking, well, I can make money doing this. And while I figure out what a grown-up's supposed to do for a living, basically. And I got around some really good people. So I really, really showed me, the business side of it. Like you could make this a business. And again, how serious and how respected your profession is how serious you take it and how much respect you basically earn by, how you carry yourself and how you treat your business. So I was lucky that I got around some people that were, again, really showed me the business side. I got all into that for 2-3 years. Ended up managing the club that I was at. I managed clubs at another company after that as well, too, just managing training departments. And all through that time, I was always into bodybuilding. That's kind of the way that I always trained. I always still I was always my ideal client at every gym. I slowly progressed from general population to working with like whoever was in the best shape in the gym. That's who I wanted to train. And so I always worked with people that were a little bit more on that kind of advanced end of the spectrum. And probably after my first 2 or 3 years of just focusing solely on business, I realized I needed to put more time and effort into continuing education. And I always tell people a big pivot point. Someone at the company at that time told me they were personal friends with Charles Falkland. And when I was trying to talk to him about I need to step up my education, what should I do? I had been exposed to a couple guys that were into the RTS stuff, MAT stuff, But at that point in time, this guy said, go take some Paulquin stuff. He's great. And so that was the first time. I think the first class I went to, I believe I actually traveled to Toronto, might have been the very first one. And so I got hooked just from the idea of one, actually being around people smarter than me, being around like other peers, coaches that obviously took their profession serious, were willing to travel long distances. And so that was probably 2000, maybe 9, I would say. And then from there, I was just like kind of committed to myself. At least I said always twice a year, and I've stuck with that. At least twice a year, I'm going to travel somewhere for a certification, for a seminar, for whatever, just to basically set myself something to do. Half the time to learn stuff. Obviously, the other half of the time is just to get around like-minded people. And then I'll also just really like, I joke, it's like brushing your teeth. Probably a good idea. So it's like, why not just set a schedule for yourself that you're just going to adhere to? And even the couple things that I've done that I didn't end up pursuing, it's still always something good comes out of that. So I've been really, really heavy into continuing education stuff. Like I said, since 2009, 10, I've done a lot of stuff. I did everything Paulquin had at the time. So I went through his like PICP 1 and 2, did some of his extra ones. I went to biosignature and then bioprint like 3 different times, I think. Then sometime along the way, I've done some MAT stuff. I've done some RTS stuff. I've done some functional anatomy seminar stuff. I'd say RTS is probably my favorite one I've done the most with now at this point in time. And then all along the way, for anybody who knows, I worked with, I was still good friends with Ben Pekulski. Timing where I was working basically an hour away from him when he was opening MI40. I moved up basically months before MI40 opened up. And so that's when I actually started participating in social media. So a lot of people know me from my time when I worked with Ben at MI40. I was there for about 2.5 years. And overall, very good thing just to get around more, my passion's always been bodybuilding. And so that's really when I kind of started, again, just having this whole notion of having an online presence, doing some continuing education, and just kind of pursuing the ability to work with people that I wanted to work with. And then around the end of 2018, I believe, is when I left there and kind of just started going out and doing my own thing. And I've been doing my own thing since then, where I train a couple clients still, train some people when they come in and out of town sometimes as well. I always like to just kind of keep the sword sharp, always train some people, train some bodies. But I spend the majority of my time now work related, just doing kind of like content that's going to hopefully reach more people. So doing stuff on, YouTube, Instagram, all that kind of stuff. And then the rest of my time is spent with my family. So that's about as much as I can catch it up, I think, in a short period of time. It's not so short, but I always say I understand now, because like there's so many people that I've followed all the way up, where like knowing their story and relating to parts of it, really helped me relate more with that person. And so, because a lot of people see me at the end result now, it's like, oh, he talks about muscles and moment arms and anatomy and all that stuff. But I'm like, at my core, I'm like a meathead that just has done all the dumb in the trenches meathead shit for a couple decades, and just kind of layer that on top with just I think it comes hopefully with a growth mentality. Just wanting to get better personally and professionally. So.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I mean, it was funny because actually I recently posted something about that as well, just about how, what you see on Instagram is entirely choreographed, and there's like not a whole lot of stuff there that's telling you what the actual person's life is like, or how they progressed, or all the difficulties. Yeah. So it sounds like you got a pretty cool story, and you're able to get around some awesome people, especially early on.
Yeah.
So this isn't really so much related to the topic, but what is your kind of content strategy for like Instagram and YouTube? Like it's mostly educational based from what I've seen. You do like a lot of videos.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah. I don't know if I have a strategy. I should probably get one of those. To be honest, I mean, really, like, cause it's one of those things, my perception of personal training, what my perception was, I created a reality at first, I was determined. I was like, oh, I can't be a personal training for a living, because this is what I had perceived it as. And that's what I made it as a reality in my brain. So honestly, when so the whole social media thing at first, I just perceived it as like this negative thing, because especially like it is a lot different now, in my opinion. In some ways, it's a lot better as platforms all progress towards, more longer videos and able to write more and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of right when I was first just seeing Instagram, I was like, people are just posting pictures of their abs and their asses, and there's not a whole lot past that. And but I finally got talked in. This is when I was at MI40. Ben, a couple other people around me were encouraging, and even Ben at the time was like, "You just need to start writing stuff and video and stuff." And I'm like, "Why?" And he's like, "Just do it, man. Just put out some good information. You don't have to have a why yet." And so I'm like, "All right." And to be honest, I always liked public speaking. I always liked writing. I didn't realize at the time before I started that had always been a component, whether it was at school or in jobs that I had. I always had components of public speaking, and, where I'd be teaching groups of people or speaking on calls or writing weekly things. I used to, even at my job, I used to have to write, weekly updates or whatever it was. And for some reason, I'd always like make them entertaining or funny, or I'd turn things in where if it was like a group of managers and several clubs, where I'd basically like shit talk the other managers and the other clubs, just for fun, because I'm like competitive and I like just writing funny shit. And so anyway, when I started social media, I was just like, well, I'm gonna just kind of. I started writing stuff, and if anybody's following my stuff, I got these long ass captions explaining all this shit. And especially at the time, you remember one of my good friends, still my business partner at this point in time, with stuff was like, hey, just so you know, man, he's like, people, I don't know if they're going to read all that, man. People just want to see like quick, 15 seconds. I think it was like 15 seconds at that point in time, and show a muscle and like move on. And my joke was, I was like, well, I like to write that way. And I would do one, especially in the beginning when you have like 4 followers. It's like my wife and my mom probably. I'm like, I would just write a post and I'd send it to my wife because she didn't have Instagram. I'd just like say, hey, here's what I wrote. Do you think this is funny? And if she thought it was funny, I was like, all right, well, sweet. I'm entertaining my wife. So we're golden. And honestly, I didn't have a strategy at first, which I think in some ways was beneficial because it sounds cliche, but I kind of made my thing my own. And as far as the actual content itself, I think that's where a lot of people I think are missing it. People that are having a hard time with content aren't actually trainers or aren't actually coaches. Because I never had a hard time with what am I actually going to film? What am I actually going to show? It's like, well, I had a full clientele at that point in time, so I'm training 10 clients a day. So it's like every single thing I should do is obviously with the idea of benefiting someone. So if at any point in time, I should be able to like, hey, here's a conversation I had with a client, discuss that topic. Hey, here's an exercise I did with a client. Here's why I did this. Here's my own workouts. Here's why I'm choosing this. And that's basically all I did. I didn't really have a plan for whatever. I was just like, well, here's what I'm doing and I'm going to talk about it. And obviously, like social media works, if people follow for a while, then after a while, then, with these little clips here and there, you start to paint a little bit of a broader picture of stuff. And so if I say I have a theme, the reality is it's not, I think that again, it's a lot of people try and just go right to that end result where they're like, how do I produce content? And I'm generally still just focused on how am I training people? How am I producing results? And then I just basically talk about that sporadically. The joke is honestly, I probably need a little bit better structure with some of my content. But at the end of the day, too, it's like, if people really follow along long enough, it's like, well, these are the things that I'm doing. This is why I talk about this. Like, hopefully you should get a general feel of the concepts and principles that I do. And, so it's a balance of really, again, everything comes down to I completely understand the meathead world. That's the funny thing is people, again, want to occasionally say, you get the excuse of if I'm doing something, not conventional or whatever, there's always the excuse of like, but Ronnie. People are like, well, but Ronnie, like, look what Ronnie did. Look what Arnold did. Why the hell are you doing all this? And the thing I think is funny about that is it doesn't offend me that I think people, think what I'm doing is dumb. It offends me that they don't think that I know about Ronnie and Arnold. Like I know more about Arnold and Ronnie than you do. And the guys that are Ronnie are the guys, the current day Ronnies. I'm working with those guys right now. It's like, I get it. I totally get it. And I've never actually said things Arnold did were dumb or Ronnie did was dumb or whatever. I just, if anything, try and create a better context around all that. Like, well, here's what Ronnie did. Here's maybe why this would work great for him and maybe not work great for you or whatever. And the reality is some people are just offended by thinking, which is the sad thing. It's like they'd rather be emotional. And when challenged with the thought process, the first thing that challenges your current thought process or current belief or current actions is to respond emotionally. And I say that too, having been there, because I've been that. Like obviously being entrenched as a meathead first, I can remember key points in my career presented with information or a different thought process or whatever. And I remember just getting butthurt. I just remember being emotional and being mad at the person presenting. At the time, I couldn't have told you why. And then luckily, some of them took a while for me to look back and be like, this person was just presenting like information. He wasn't saying I should do this or that, or this was good or bad. He was just presenting stuff. And because of where my head was at, I got emotional. So, knowing that I like the bodybuilding side, I know the bodybuilding side, I know it very well. And then I just try and accompany that with a growth mindset. If anything, I'm just really trying to get people to see things, as they are, to really see the bigger picture of stuff, because we're in an industry where it's easy for me to sell, hey, here's this rep scheme gimmick. That's my training, right? Or here's this specific whatever, like just make up something unique, put a name to it, nothing complex to understand. And here, go do this. This is my gimmick. And that could probably sell really easy because it's straightforward. It's not complicated. The good and the downside from business, if I'm saying, hey, here's all these principles, watch a few hours of videos, see this in application, start to figure out where you fit in with this, where your clients fit in with this. It's not as quick or easy of a sell. But long-term, once people start to kind of open their eyes to just, I can just look at things without being emotional about them and then just try and see where they fit or don't fit. I think that makes for better trainers and then ultimately makes for people that can produce better results for themselves as well, too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's almost like you're teaching an individual how to think and evaluate information for themselves as well. And that's tough. It takes a long, long, long time. And so, I mean, it's no surprise when people are like, oh, so I have to dedicate like actual work and I have to really think
Yeah.
critically about these things. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's no, that makes sense. That's awesome. So, I guess just to kind of dive right into it, one of the questions that I got was, are there any direct or indirect, um, like hypertrophy? Ugh, are there any indirect or direct adaptations for hypertrophy that come from strength? Like I know a lot of people will say
Um,
that muscle potentiates strength, but is there any sort of like, is the reverse of that also true?
yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously, it's one of those things where, I mean, it certainly is an interesting conversation, and you can see things depending on being goal specific and whether it is. I mean, there's even interesting research. We're always told this, how much your, potential is for increasing strength, from a neurological component, whether that actually is, if we actually look from an individual muscle standpoint and your ability to actually recruit more of something, or if it's actually from just the coordination component, because most of our measures of strength are some sort of athletic maneuver, right? Like, I mean, obviously squatting proficiently is a sport, benching proficiently is a sport, so we're obviously taught there's this adaptation that can come just from basically the brain side, of that neuromuscular junction. And then obviously there's even more research now. It's like, does that really happen? Or is there never really a time where strength occurs separate of some degree of tissue being laid down? I mean, so the short answer is, I think if there's some sort of documentable progression, of the things that we're looking at either side, whether it's, load or whatever, even in, lower rep ranges, even if we're not doing things in the typical, muscle building hypertrophy world, I think it absolutely leads to more tissue. And I think the notion of, obviously, the way a lot of people do things is, are there more efficient ways to put on tissue, quicker? Yeah, of course. But again, most people, I mean, obviously that's where periodization really comes in huge, is for people more into purely strength or more into, strength or performance based sports, because obviously, like you said, that tissue will lead to, higher output in some degree if you can coordinate it and use it. But at the same time, it can take away, obviously, from whatever your output or your performance is if you spend too much time doing those things. So I think both ways it's pretty inseparable, in my opinion. Like I said, I don't think I've ever seen anyone have some significant documented progression of strength, where they're not out also having tissue being laid down. And then the tough part, obviously, is, I mean, I don't know how you would even, because it's a spectrum, right? So there's never really a point in time where someone's technically not doing, if someone's doing even a program where they never do anything more than a 1 rep max. I mean, that's technically still on the spectrum of, there's intramuscular force production. It's for some amount of volume. So even if the hypertrophy wheelhouse is here and this is way over here, it's still on the spectrum, and even if we look at someone that trains like a traditional strength athlete, of here's what they're doing for all of their performance, their power, their strength work, but they even have some sort of hypertrophy block in there, then there's never really a time we can completely exclude, oh, there was no hypertrophy work occurring. Did this person still put on tissue while doing purely strength stuff? So it's an interesting conversation. But yeah, no, I would have to say the short is, I don't think they're ever exclusive of each other either way on that. So
Yeah, and so I've definitely seen a lot more of the research coming out and a lot more people coming out, being somewhat critical against the association between muscle and strength adaptations. So, the question kind of being like, okay, well, is the new contractile tissue that's being laid down, is that actively contributing to greater force production and better, motor skills, like you said, for the specific tasks, since
yeah.
strength is like joint angle and force vector specific, right?
Mm-hmm.
And part of the argument that I've seen is, well, are we getting an increase in tendon stiffness? Because that
Mm-hmm.
makes a big difference. Are we
Yeah.
changing leverages, right? So for instance, like I'm 280, and I've been
Yeah.
I've been dieting down, so my stomach has gone down quite a lot actually. I'm getting much
Yeah.
heavier, and that absolutely impacts your squat, right?
Yeah.
So is it a change in leverages? How much of it is a change in leverage? How much of it
Yeah.
is a change in contractile tissue and force
Mm-hmm.
production? And I think that's kind of an interesting conversation. I've heard people say that there doesn't seem to be a strong association, which that I wholeheartedly disagree with.
Yeah.
But I think it's really interesting when you maybe break it down to a little bit more specific, like, okay, well, at what point is the cutoff where, okay, now we're starting to see those things really make a difference? Because if someone gains 30 pounds of muscle, I don't give a fuck who you are. In my opinion, they're going to be stronger.
Yeah.
But will you be stronger if you gain 5 pounds? Will you be stronger if you gain, 7 or 10 pounds? Like, I
Yeah.
don't know. It's a little bit less clear, at least in my opinion. Have you seen
Yeah.
any of the research on that, or any of the discussions that have been happening around that?
A little bit. I mean, so to be honest, like lots of that stuff, it's nice, especially within the hypertrophy world. I mean, I have a couple of my research people that obviously they're going to fit my bias of, I want someone that's still putting things into, principles and concepts. So again, obviously keeping up with research can be a full-time job. And obviously that's a lot of people do a really good job of that. I mean, they do research reviews where it's like, hey, here's all these things. We put all the time and effort, and here's the compartmentalized versions of what you can actually figure out from there. No, so the short answer is, I'm not always digging into like what's the most current or what's whatever. I actually look, a lot of the ways that I recommend people is I follow a few coaches. I see their interpretations of things like that. And honestly, that's, that realm, again, for what I can actually do or what I could actually help someone with is kind of out of my scope of practice. So it's one of those things where, the same as you said, it's like, where's the actual end result of like, well, what is the point of, like you said, is it 5 pounds is important, 10, well, 30 pounds, obviously something's happening. Where's it in between? I think all that's like neat, but at the same time, I don't, it's one of those things, same with everything in the hypertrophy world. Some people will get lost in the middle there and argue about stuff. And I was like, well, that's where I don't want to spend my time. Right. It's like, well, let's kind of, obviously you have a best plan and a best plan of action. And sometimes you just see what happens, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work, type deal. So obviously, like anytime I've ever helped in any capacity, someone that's more of a performance or strength athlete, my whole direction is, how can we just make if you're doing hypertrophy work, you're doing a hypertrophy block, whatever it is, how can we make that more efficient? Really just as far as, again, you've got all these things you have to do, with your actual skill, with your strength work, with whatever it is. How can we make sure that hypertrophy block is eating into everything else you have to do as little as possible? We're going to have the least impact overall, because that's why I think a lot of people mess it up. And the strength world is just layering way too much right on top, where they might be able to get the job done with less. So, I mean, I've seen a little bit of that, but I'm definitely not in the weeds with that at all right now. So it's, anytime people send me anything or information on that, especially we get more to the strength side, I'm always like, oh, neat. I'm happy to like look through it, but I don't really feel like I'm in a spot to formulate any strong conclusions on that based on, I'm not applying it to populations a whole lot,
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think one thing that you mentioned actually that I'm almost certain is going to go over everyone's head, or most people's head, is, the idea of doing less rather than more.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's something, especially like intermediates and quite a few advanced individuals still do that, is like they'll do, I don't know, 8 sets when they could get away with 3.
Yeah.
Like you're not really seeing a big difference, but you're seeing a massive spike in terms of like generated fatigue from that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that's definitely something to pay attention to for sure. One of the things that I wanted you to kind of illustrate as far as like how you implement these things are, could you just kind of briefly describe some of the primary mechanisms involved in hypertrophy, and then how, like what that actually means from a practical standpoint? Because a lot of people will say, oh, mechanical tension or metabolites and this and this and this, but then it's like, okay, but what does that mean? Like, what do you actually do? That's kind of where that sort of practical side falls off.
So I always say, like, because I always refer, because he's one of my favorite, and some of this is when you're, all research works, like, we have these things in practice in the field that these perceivably work, then obviously research just takes a comb through that and says, okay, well, let's figure out, how much of this is going to be, replicable for a different population, what might be the, the ends of this, like, why would this work for this extreme and not that extreme, and all those things. So, I always have my idea, starting honestly first and foremost with myself of, 15 years old, moving on up, what did I see producing results with me and myself? And I think that's honestly important. And then working with people in the college population, working with general population, working with the best in the world, bodybuilders, whatever. I like when I find, again, because this is good or bad, it is what it is. It fits my bias. If I have this encyclopedia of what I've seen produce results, and obviously in that big library of it, there's stuff where I'm like, okay, here's outlier genetics, here's outlier, this and that, here's outlier with drugs, whatever it is. But you still see this general trend of like, okay, we know these things work. Now let's see if we can figure out why they work and what we can make work better. So a guy that does that, one of the best in the hypertrophy world, is Chris Beardsley. I really like the way that he looks at lots of research, and instead of just kind of going the way the wind blows with one study, really tries to kind of put something together. So he's a guy that I like a lot. For really clarifying, well, what are we looking at as far as, this whole, like you said, metabolite thing, this intramuscular force thing, and whatever. And so really, I think it really comes down to, and I don't think there's ever actually been research that shows any type of, hypertrophy response exclusive of intramuscular force. And so even when they're trying to reproduce some things from, hey, let's create these metabolites and see if those actually lead to hypertrophy themselves, from my understanding, they've never actually been able to demonstrate it when intramuscular force was excluded. So kind of Chris Beardsley at some points in time has this whole thing where he really thinks the only driver potentially for hypertrophy is intramuscular force, and everything else might potentially just be symptoms of that. But it's one of those things where I'll clarify what the hell that means and why I really put the focus on what I focus on with training. But I would say, for the reason of what I've seen in the gym and what I think a lot of research points to, is most people should put their time and effort into producing more intramuscular force. And so the simple things that we know that seem to lead to that, one is load. So just specifically having a certain load, like if you're legitimately using your 5 or 6 rep max for something, even if you're doing your 1 rep max, because of the load, right away, you're going to have some high threshold motor recruitment, which in and of itself is one of the things that leads to intramuscular force being higher. It seems like unintentionally slow rep speed is also a very important thing for intramuscular force production.
And that could also
unintentionally slow rep speed. Yes. So there's research that shows if I intentionally train slow, so I pick something that I can do, 10 reps with, and I just do 5 reps slow as hell, and then I rack it. It's like, well, will that produce high levels of intramuscular force? And the research shows no. Whereas if you're moving the bar unintentionally slow, which basically happens whenever you train high levels of fatigue, most importantly, close to failure points, doesn't have to be to failure, but close to failure. It's been shown regardless of how, like if this is where people get mixed up sometimes, in my opinion, with this idea of they have to move the bar fast or explosively or whatever. And in reality, if you can have the intent of doing that, I think is probably more important. And you'll see when people train close to failure, the intent can be to move the bar as fast as possible, contract as hard as you can. But if you're getting close to failure reps, it's going to move slow. And that's kind of the unintentionally slow part, when basically either from load or fatigue, or really the combination of both, that bar starts to move slow. That seems to be one of the biggest contributors as well, to high levels of intramuscular force. So the reality is, where I think things make the most sense is if you look at what happens when someone's doing, straight sets within the hypertrophy wheelhouse. So I'm going to do straight sets, and, basically the bottom end, I'd probably say 5 reps, but let's just say 5 to 10. And you're taking those sets in close proximity to failure because of the load, because of the fatigue you accumulate through the set, and because of the unintentionally slow rep speed at the end. That's an equation for high intramuscular force production. And so, getting a little bit more complicated with some of that, we could actually look at what occurs over the course of the rep. And this is stuff it's tough to, for people to kind of get, basically just listening to me talk. But this is where other things come in, especially for the hypertrophy world, like an exercise's profile, because then there's the notion of volume is important. So how do we look at how much volume or how much whatever? And I always say volume starts with 1 rep. You could have one exercise that basically has one challenging point over the entire range of motion. And I could consider the other 75% essentially a waste if we're looking at what muscles demands are over that point of range of motion. Or we could have an exercise that has equal demands of intramuscular force over the entire range of motion. And I say, if you start to look at stuff like that, and then you start to add in things like form, control, things like that, you could have someone that has, based on their form, based on their exercise selection, could have, these numbers sound extreme, but in my opinion, 4, 5, 6 times the volume in 1 rep compared to the way that someone else, completes. This could be the same muscle group, could be the same range of motion within 1 rep. And so I think that matters as well too. And so that's where I think that's the people kind of get confused about, like, well, how the hell could I possibly do less? Why would 2 sets get the job done of 8 sets? Well, between, again, exercise selection, between how you're performing those sets, being how close you're taking them to failure, all those things are ways to accumulate effective volume. And I think effective volume really just means how much time, and again, time under tension, in my opinion, is not important necessarily the way people make it out to, but there is a component of basically just common sense stuff. Again, if I'm moving my arm in space, no one can see, but I'm moving my arm in space for lateral raise. If 1/4 of that range of motion is challenging, where I actually have the environment created internally to produce enough tension to actually lead to this cascade of events for hypertrophy, or I have an exercise that produces that same environment through the entire range of motion. So it's a 90-degree range of motion my upper arm is going through. I think that equates to 4 times the volume. So that's where, again, if I get something where that's kind of my, I guess, kind of one of my big principles that I have for people is this notion of efficiency, which again comes from exercise selection, comes from the way you do things, comes from, in my opinion, what's the most efficient as far as, training proximity to failure, total volume. It's kind of, I guess it's kind of different than what some people say, according to what I hear back, but I'm always looking for people for the least volume possible to produce maximal results. So I'm always looking for the lower threshold of volume that we can actually show documentable progress, and just try and keep it there instead of constantly trying to push volume as a means to continue, that whole hypertrophy process. So that's a whole mess of crap. Hopefully that made sense for somebody listening. But
No, that was great. That you brought up a couple points that I wanted to touch on as well. And the first one was just, again, about doing less, because I've definitely found that as I've progressed as a coach, working with myself and athletes. So I recently hired my first coach about 3 months ago, and he's taking me through my prep for nationals. It's been going really, really well. But the one thing that he has really changed my mind on is how much is actually required, kind of what you're talking about, right? Like, do you really need 4 sets of this accessory, or can you just do 1 set really fucking hard?
Yeah.
And like have a very high intensity of effort and get the same stimulus with, essentially like 1/3 the fatigue. And that's something that I was very, very surprised about, how much I can get out of doing such little work, but having it be like extremely intentional. And it's funny because now when I go to the gym, you just kind of look around, and even for, assistance lifts, right? Or accessories. And I know this is kind of a little bit more powerlifting, but I mean, I would imagine the same stuff for bodybuilding, right? You see someone doing like a dumbbell single leg RDL, and they're just kind of going through the motions, and they finish, and you're like, okay, but that wasn't like hard for you, like it was challenging, you're working, but it's not like hard. And it's pretty, I don't know, for me anyways, it's definitely been a big game changer, and something that I emphasize a whole lot more now with my athletes as well. But kind of getting back on point, you talked about internal versus external cues, or at least you alluded to that. So how important is the mind muscle connection, and do you focus on that through, or I guess when you're cueing, what's the significance of internal versus external cues, and when would you use either, or do you use both?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I would say, if this would be something, if I was good at content creation and had a good schedule, I'd make a sweet infographic for this. But no, I honestly think it'd be something where when someone's new, so if I have somebody that I'm training, especially general population, but let's say someone's just, beginner, even intermediate, and especially in the bodybuilding world, let's say they're beginner, intermediate, even if you've been training for a while. Honestly, all of my cueing starts with external, where it's like there's some things that are relatively inescapable as far as setting someone up for the best opportunity for something to do what you want it to do. So it's like, okay, well, because most people, especially new people, and this, I think a lot of people mess this kind of stuff up, they try and take some of my end content and apply it to Mr. and Mrs. Jones in the gym. And I'm like, no, we're not talking about squeezing and contraction, all that kind of stuff right away. That terminology means nothing to the average person. So no, I always start external first, put someone's body in the positions where it's going to have the best opportunity to use what you want it to use. And then from there, it's just a spectrum. I don't really, it's going to be different with everyone that comes across the board, but I think it's safe to say, as you progress, and hopefully you're progressing, everyone starts with some notion of form and the positions, and that improves as you go from beginner to intermediate to, okay, I feel like I'm in a pretty good spot now. And then I think some of those internal things become more important. So that's a cool thing. Everyone knows in the bodybuilding world, it is important. And now obviously there's some research that shows that as well too, where again, without adjusting any body positions, you tell someone to focus on something or do this thing. And, we can show higher levels of EMG or whatever, which may or may not correlate to output. But I think it's a very important thing. And the simple thing I always tell people is, again, you don't even have to go too deep down the whole intramuscular thing. But once you kind of get this idea in the bodybuilding world, the hypertrophy world, is that you are trying to create something within that muscle, right? So again, the whole thing we're trying to do is within that muscle, we need to create some sort of environment, that it's going to, again, that whole bunch of effects leads to actually laying down new tissue. The goal is to make it as hard as possible on that muscle, and I think that's a good concept for people to kind of take. And if they're honest with themselves, can take that and kind of just, again, if it depends, there's a whole different levels of mentality of, again, does someone have self-awareness? Because if they don't have any self-awareness, then, this could all fall on deaf ears. But the reality is, if someone really, really gets, okay, like the whole point of this is to make this as hard as possible on myself, then all those things kind of are going to organize, I think, a little bit more neatly in their brain, the way that makes the most sense for them, right? Where it's like, okay, I'm in these positions. I know this is the range of motion that I need. But then in reality is, did I go from A to B, and did I bounce at this part? Did I intentionally do something where if I'm doing it this way, I know this is not that this is always, but a lot of time is, I can feel the muscle more, it's more painful, or am I starting to do things to intentionally avoid that pain or mitigate that pain or lessen that pain? And so, yeah, that the whole thing, I think that really comes down to, that's kind of the coaching, art / skill set, is how do you move on that spectrum with somebody? Where do they fall, whether it's their first day, or you're on this journey with somebody for months or years, or you're getting someone advanced intermediate? Because like I said, I think that's why I'd say a spectrum is great, because you could get someone that's in a good spot for something, but they could be super beginner for something else, right? So this person's advanced, but they've got this shit body part. And I look at it like, man, it's like you're in bad positions. You're not doing the things right. You could start back kind of with, at ground zero with that person, and then kind of build them up across that spectrum. And they'd probably move faster than somebody else because they get it elsewhere. But yeah, I think that's definitely a skill set, where I don't think there's 100% right or wrong way to do it, especially when you have individual people all at different spots. But that would be a good trend, I would think, for every coach is, again, more beginners, start external, put them in positions, and then over time work on this sensation thing. And that does become important. But again, it's really always going to feel like, because that's the funny thing too, is even a coach, no matter how many people I've worked with, I technically still don't know what it feels like for somebody, right? And I've seen this. I've seen some people where my joke is, I see it more in females than males for some reason. And it's in some ways a good thing. I think females can tolerate more systemically horrible stuff than men can. And I've seen some females do crazy shit that would literally, I think, have guys just like down for the count for like 2 weeks. And because of that, though, I found that more females I deem are sneaky cheaters. And again, anybody can be a sneaky cheater, but I've seen it happen with females more often, where they just do these subtle little things that I don't even know if they perceive, where it's just one little bounce, one little move, one little whatever, where I find it's more of a challenge to make things very locally horrible for a female, like to teach a female, like, hey, here's how you make your, just your biceps cramp and horrible and feel like it's going to fall off. They're more likely to just want to do something that they can just tolerate better kind of systemically. And so again, it's really a tricky thing, I think, where again, I have to get that into somebody's brain and realize, look, it's not just about how far and how, can you take this whole thing, which may be impressive. It's about trying to get this one specific thing to this point of, a failure point or close to a failure point to some degree. So yeah, in my opinion, that's fun stuff. I like that when I'm coaching with somebody. It's a challenge of, okay, where are they on this and what's going to produce the best results ultimately? And then it's tricky with that stuff too, because like everything's got to have progression, right? And I always say form, execution, that whole mind muscle connection thing, how hard you're making things is a form of progressive overload, where I say if your form goes from a perceived 4 out of 10 to 8 out of 10, even if the weight on the bar doesn't change, it will pretty much definitively lead to more intramuscular force. But it's really easy for people to just get caught the same way people get caught just trying to put more and more weight on the bar. I've seen people just trying to squeeze shit harder and harder and harder every single week. I was like, okay, well, you can only progress squeezing this, so much over time. And it's literally people just basically turn every exercise into an isometric. They're literally just squeezing a 10-pound dumbbell, in space for this curl. And I'm like, okay, well, we've gone off track here somewhere. We need to get back on track. So it's all that stuff is, I think it's fun. And I think it's a challenge. And all that really comes to, why is muscle building hard, right? It's the same as like there's a huge skill set there for the way you do things. It's the same with anybody that has a huge skill set. You look at like, Tiger Woods or something or whatever. It's like, well, how does he hit the golf ball the way that he does? And it's like, you look at like, well, how many hours did he practice and do all this stuff? And you could just have somebody say, it's volume. Well, I'm just going to do more. I'm just going to go hit more balls and do more shit. And there's no real easy way to say, well, no, like you have to learn all these very specific things that change the way that you do things. You literally just can't beat it into the ground with repetition. It's the way that you do things that changes the outcome more than the specifics of what you wrote on paper. Because like I said, we could all look at the Tiger print of, all right, he spent how many hours on the range, he hit how many golf balls, or any athlete, obviously. You could look at the reps, you could look at it on paper, but that never separates anybody in any sport. It's always how they do things. And that's the same in the bodybuilding world. People could look at anyone's workout on paper and be like, oh, that's 4 exercises, that's easy. Or, 2 sets each. What the hell is that? And it's like, well, it's when you see how somebody does them, you put the average person in that. And again, they might be, in a hospital bed.
Yeah, it's sort of like this reverse causality, right? Where you sort of attribute the benefit of, I don't know, something to just an arbitrary metric that you might be looking at. Like the whole, well,
Yeah.
Ronnie squatted 800 pounds, so therefore, bodybuilders need to lift super, super heavy. And it's like, okay, well, I mean, I'm not too dialed into like high level bodybuilding. I do like it,
Mhm.
but so I might be wrong, but I swear I've seen Phil Heath say that he doesn't like to squat and deadlift, and he
Mhm.
prefers like leg press and things like that, just because it's like less hard on his back and less fatiguing and
Mhm.
stuff. So, I mean, if I look at someone like Phil Heath, and he's got like what, I don't know how many fucking Mr. Olympia titles, and he's saying that he doesn't squat super heavy, I'm probably going to pay attention to that, at some
Yeah.
point. So
Yeah.
you also talked a little bit about the differences in terms of range of motion, and so I'm not sure if you're like, when you look at an exercise, because I know even Brad Schoenfeld, he said some really interesting papers talking about like, changing joint angles to attack a muscle and just in a slightly different way, and that tends to lead to greater hypertrophy if you alter the joint angles. Um, and then you said something about adjusting the range of motion. So, like, are you looking at the fiber orientation and muscle action, and then just saying, okay, this is where the lever arm is the longest. This is where we have a disadvantage at the moment. I'm like, how are you determining which of those ranges is going to be the best? And then, do you have some sort of combination of, okay, we're going to do this, and then we're also going to train through the full range of motion, as well as prioritizing
Yeah.
the specialized range of motions for specific exercises? And then, sorry, another question on top of that
Yeah.
is, are there any times where that wouldn't necessarily be so effective? Like, let's say the trade-off might not be that great, like doing a partial squat, for instance,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. So a couple things to unpack. I'm trying to think of which order to go in with all this. So, I mean, first and foremost, yeah, the things that I look at, and I would say the start of everything, because it's I like to start with, from a muscle itself, just kind of having a baseline principle that seems to still hold true as far as force production is going to go, is look at what a muscle, any muscle in the body, for the most part, is going to follow a trend as far as what is that body muscle capable of doing if we literally like take it out of the body. So if we take a body out of it and we're looking purely at this length tension relationship thing, what are muscles capable of doing as far as force production? And there is a strong correlation between, force production, literally if we're looking kind of like bone to bone pull, and obviously what we're doing from an intramuscular force production standpoint. And what we see is that if we're actually looking at contractile tissue, most muscles seem to be the strongest, which will translate to the most intramuscular force production in their mid range, then probably their length and range, and definitively the weakest in their short and range. And so obviously that has a combination to do with cross bridging potential and all that kind of shit, which again, I tend to not get too lost in the weeds there. Occasionally I'll read some interesting stuff. But again, as far as what research still shows, is that's the pretty definitive curve of where we're talking about literally just a length tension thing. We're looking at one muscle before we put it in the body and it crosses over joints and things get more complicated. That is a pretty solid principle that I adhere to. So if we're going to choose exercises and we have this notion of efficiency, right? We don't want to do 10 exercises. If I can do 3 exercises, I'd rather do 3 than 10. If I can do 2, I'd rather do 2 than 5. For this notion of efficiency, I prioritize things that load a muscle or overload a muscle in its mid to lengthened range, and then kind of deprioritize things that overload muscle in a short position. So I'd say that's a pretty standard thing. And that's literally this notion of taking stuff outside of the body. And then when you put a muscle inside the body, if we look at what it's capable of doing from a force production, if we're really looking at torque at a joint, then that obviously changes through a range of motion. It changes as far as how does that muscle, that's when we're talking about vectors or internal moment arms, whatever you want to look at, as far as how that muscle crosses over relative to the joint axis. And that just makes things confusing a little bit from an external force production standpoint or a torque production standpoint. So again, it's some of that sounds relatively complicated. But the funny part is a lot of that actually comes to some things that people overall got right in like the meathead realm, like these big compound movements. Most things, if you go through body part by body part, the things that historically we've found to be the most effective, just old school stuff, tend to overload muscles in their mid to length and range. Now, I don't agree with the terminology, but things that people like, oh, this is more for finishing or pumping, or people would say carve in the detail, tend to be things that overload muscles in the shortened position or the shortened range. Now, again, the terminology of the perceived outcome, I think, is different, but I don't think it's inaccurate to say if you're putting all your time and effort, like, again, even let's say I can pick one body part or one exercise for quads. Would I prefer it to be a squat pattern or a leg extension? Personally, I would prefer a squat pattern because a squat pattern is going to overload the quads in that mid to lengthen range, where a leg extension is going to overload it in that shortened position. Now, the reality is in programming, you can have both, and I think over time should have both, but I don't think it has to even happen in the same workout, and I couldn't even tell you exactly what period of time it should happen in. So if I'm being efficient, pick exercises that overload mid and lengthened range. And then if I'm really being efficient, then there's this notion of range of motion as well too. Well, if I can find an exercise that overloads the mid and lengthened range, or potentially even comes into the shortened range, like if I can find one exercise that loads a muscle through 90% of its contractile range with a load that matches what it's capable of doing, then those are going to be the things that I'm going to pick. And those will be the exercises I kind of call everybody calls this the ship of like my meat and potato exercises. Those are the things that I'm going to try and take. I'm going to stick with the longest periods of time, assuming they fit my body well. And those are the things I think you have the most opportunity for progression, and in turn, the most opportunity for creating the environment that you want. And then the way that I tend to do things, and whatever you want to call it, I get caught up in the terminology too, just so people know what the hell I'm talking about. But I think there is merit still for work done once you're extremely fatigued, if you can recover from it. So people call it finishers, metabolic work, pump work, whatever. And again, I'll use all those terms just so people know what I'm talking about. But the reality is, if you've done an hour and a half or 2 hour session, whatever you're doing at the end is not going to be using load as the main driver for hypertrophy. What you're using at that point in time is going to be fatigue and something that still trains in close proximity to a failure. So just from a coaching preference, I like to use that stuff to train ranges of motion that maybe we didn't train with the big meat and potato stuff. So in my opinion, it's a very easy way that, again, anecdotally and evidence implies that, current evidence and peer-reviewed evidence implies that training muscles through their full range of motion is important. And so that's a very easy and simple way to do it, in my opinion, is you could have 80% of your training revolving around those big movements that train those ranges of motion. And then you can use you can call it accessory work. I think it's the same thing, honestly, really in the bodybuilding world. You can use that work, to still cover other ranges of motion that maybe you didn't already. And at the same time, and that's the thing too, where there's research that shows, if you're training a muscle in its fully shortened position for what you're doing, for the load you're using, for the range of motion you're going through, it's more metabolically demanding. So if there is something to, this metabolic stimulus and creating this environment of metabolites, and that leads to this pathway, then okay. Or it could just be the fact that you're still training in close proximity to failure. And if you're doing so, you're, having a lot of fatigue, which can lead to high threshold motor recruitment as well too. And ultimately unintentionally slow rep speed, which I think would just have more intramuscular force, probably just from a smaller overall percentage of contractile fibers. So regardless of what the hell is going on, bodybuilders have been doing that for a long time. They do their heavy work stuff, and then they might call it carving the detail at the end, or just get a pump at the end, or whatever it is. But I think the methodology is, if you can recover from it, is pretty good. So again, that's a whole mess. I think I hopefully answered some of that stuff, and some of that makes sense. Or if something didn't make sense, let me know.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And so I guess kind of building on that, then you did kind of talk a little bit about like high load versus low load for hypertrophy there. The primary movements of that day are going to focus a little bit more on mechanical tension, and then the rest is going to be a little bit more on let's just call it like metabolic work or whatever, kind of going in closer proximity to failure at higher rep ranges. So at what point do you, when you structure training, and sorry, I'm going to back up for a second, actually. There is some research that's sort of suggesting that periodized versus non-periodized training for hypertrophy doesn't seem to make a difference, right? And I think a lot of people have interpreted that as we don't necessarily need to plan training and can just kind of come in and decide whatever we want in the day. I think that becomes pretty problematic. But in terms of high load, low load, and then maybe like blocks that potentiate the next thing, if that's something you sort of believe in, how do you structure your training around that? Or are you always kind of having some sort of concurrent model where you're utilizing a pretty broad spectrum of rep ranges and different energy systems?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So that is a good thing to bring up where it's, I think in the hypertrophy world, the only thing that gets you into trouble, and even into trouble isn't the right thing. If we look at these purely separate blocks, like saying, okay, well, we can do something that's for pure, let's do a strength block, because that will lead to obviously our ability to produce more within these rep ranges that are the hypertrophy blocks. So people will do purely, here's the strength block, here's this pure hypertrophy block, and then people will do purely metabolic blocks or whatever you want to call it as well too. And I would agree. I don't think there's any evidence that doing blocks like that has any benefit. And even I could make the argument sometimes that could cause detriment, especially depending on the population you're working with, where it's when people, anytime I've seen people try and run purely, metabolic blocks or whatever, aside from maybe either the most genetically blessed or enhanced, it's inadequate intramuscular force production. And I think people just tend to lose tissue. And because of what I think occurs from a volume and an inflammation standpoint, sometimes it sets you up for a worse spot when you're coming into your next block or next rotation. The things that I look at the most when it comes into, if I'm going to periodize something, it's basically volume. So I will adjust volume over periods of time, depending on the individual, depending on current goal, current recovery, current whatever, because I think within the bodybuilding world, that's the biggest thing that can have like a systemic impact on, recovery or whatever, getting to the point of being potentially overtrained. That being said, my goal with most people is basically if I have someone in a good spot for recovery, if someone's intermediate to advanced, then they can run what I consider a very kind of, I don't know, the word you used was a good word, but basically we have these things running, at the same time where just a traditional hypertrophy session will be, we've got 80% of it is focused on these meat and potato things, progressive overload, log booking. And then we have some, accessory work, metabolic work, pump work, finisher work occurring at the end. And if I have someone's recovery is good, I can have someone run a structure like that for months, where their basic thing is they're just focusing on is keeping a stable, a similar level of overall training volume, and just trying to document some degree of progressive overload basically for months. And then where I have people depending on, because you get people all over the place with recovery, where that's again, this notion of having to do blocks, even having to vary volume. Like, why would somebody that sleeps 10 hours a night, has relatively low life stress, is perfect with their diet, good genetics for recovery, whatever the hell you want to call it, why would that person need to periodize blocks every 6 or 12 weeks to basically deload or devolume or whatever the hell you want to call it, if they haven't had enough systemic stuff actually accumulate to put them in a point where they can't keep up with it? And so I think that's the problem with these pre-planned blocks, especially where in hypertrophy we don't really have we don't have a peak performance, right? We're not trying to peak for something specific. It's just over time, we're just constantly basically trying to have this progression, to some degree, just straight linear progression occurring. And then where it varies too, I vary definitely depending on goal dependent as well too. And also, basically training level. So, your training age. So for people that are more beginner to intermediate, I think it makes a lot more sense to put people having more time and effort just in those meat and potato things, not putting much time, effort, or stock in, metabolic pump work, things like that. Where I think, again, that little bit of additional work and that little bit of additional effective volume, I think becomes more important as you get a little bit more advanced. So that's one thing I kind of changed a little bit from individual to individual, but that component has a little bit more to do, again, with training age, are you beginner, intermediate, advanced, that type of deal. So yeah, but if I have people all the time where I always say for us, it's a devolume phase. So I have people where the goal is, my devolume phases or my recovery phases for people tend to look kind of like strength blocks to some degree, where I'll generally shift someone from, more of kind of a traditional, I don't know what the hell traditional bodybuilding split is. I have people all over the place on that. But if I have somebody where they're training, body part stuff, maybe a push pull lower, or they still have a body part day or whatever it is, I'll take them into periods of time where they have a lot more off days. Their training tends to go to either half body or full body. The volume of everything all across the board is way down. But generally, I also shift their rep ranges lower. So I'll put them in something where they're sticking in maybe, the 4 to 6 rep range. They're not training as close to failure, maybe intentionally staying 1 to 2 reps short of failure. And really we'll put someone in a period of time where they're still keeping, some intramuscular force demands high, based mainly on load, and still training somewhat close to failure, which I think really helps them hold tissue. But over that period of time, volume being generally it's like a quarter of what someone might normally do, even for my stuff, considerably being relatively low volume. But doing that for most people in the bodybuilding world, just a few weeks can be enough for them to recover from that systemic whole deal and feel fresh and ready to come out the other side. And most importantly, not have lost a whole lot of tissue on the way. I mean, I think that's the thing you touched on. We see that in the bodybuilding world as well too, where people just come in the gym at any point in time and go through the motions, right? They just come in. I'm like, oh, that's why I don't like, why don't we do 5 sets of 10? I'm like, nobody does 5 sets of 10 hard. It's impossible. You do 5 sets of 10, and you're either saving yourself the first 4, and then you do the 5th set hard, or maybe you do the first one hard and all the rest suck after that, or they all are just fluff, which is the more likely thing. And so people do that on recovery phases as well too. They're like, oh, I gotta train lighter and just kind of let my body catch up. And they'll go in the gym and just do a whole bunch of junk volume and just pump stuff. I'm like, you're probably just making more inflammation with zero benefit for holding on to tissue. And again, most normal people, when they try and do that, sometimes end up feeling worse out the other side, and most of the time lose tissue coming out the other side.
Yeah, that's a great point. I've definitely seen that. I trained at a private club where it's like powerlifters and strongmen. So
yeah,
if you've got like a 600-pound squat, 400-pound bench, and a 700-pound deadlift, you're very mediocre there.
Yeah.
And like maybe once a year, just because of my schedule and travel schedule, things like that, I'll have to pop into like a commercial gym.
Yeah.
And every time I do, without fail, I'll always see a guy who is doing like 30 exercises for his shoulders.
Yeah.
And he'll be like, oh, we're just going to, like go really slowly, and I want you to feel the burn. And it's like, okay, cool. We're feeling the burn, but like 2 minutes later, you can still do more shit.
Yeah.
It's just like, it's, I don't know. It's almost like if you just flex your muscle like crazy, it's going to cramp up.
Yeah.
And it's going to hurt, but no one in the right mind would think that that's enough to be a sufficient stimulus to cause, a robust amount of muscle growth, over time, if you're consistently doing that. And so there does seem to be like some sort of cutoff point. And I know Brad said it's like roughly 30%, and then you kind of have to hit that 30 to 50 rep mark or whatever and like really fail. But I also think that sometimes people take that way too much to the extreme, just kind of like you were saying, where they have 12 exercises, and it's like, instead of 12 exercises, like, why don't you just do 2 or 3 sets of really heavy, not heavy, but like heavy relative to the rep range and whatever, right?
Yeah.
Of like overhead press, and then maybe do like 2 or 3 other exercises just to kind of round everything off.
Yeah.
And you'll be in and out much faster, and then you leave and you're like, holy fuck, I can't lift my arm up. And so there's definitely a lot of time that's like wasted. And I think a lot of that too is exactly like what you're saying, right? It's taking a beginner and getting them to do all this like mind muscle stuff, when in reality it's such as like, dude, they don't even know, you tell them to like lift their arm up and they end up like touching their nose with their foot.
Yeah.
Like, dude, like this guy's no coordination. So I really like the progression model that you suggested, because it's really simple, where, focus on those like sort of external cues initially, and then as they progress, shift a little bit more towards the internal as it become more, intermediate advanced. I wanted to, I guess, to maybe have you touch on a nutritional aspect. So, like the association between acute versus chronic increases in muscle protein synthesis, and how important that is. Because sometimes I think that people don't necessarily understand what that is. And like you said, they put a lot of stock into something that's probably a little bit more of like a, just an additional benefit that you can do versus, it actually being like one of those big stones that you have to check off kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's, so nutrition is one of those things where I have a video on this on YouTube, which I think is a good one for everyone to watch. It's called like I don't remember what Acute, it's something really clickbaity, the secret to building muscle or something. But it really comes down to the video.
Finally.
Yeah, exactly. The secret. Well, and it's 100% accurate. It's actually not clickbait, but it's just nobody, I'm going to spoil it right now, but it's not the answer anyone wants to have. It's the stuff that you and I both know. And, like you said, people look at this stuff on, like, if there's something that produces 95% of the results, it's some of the easiest stuff on paper, but it's the hardest stuff to adhere to. And people rather look at the other 5% of stuff where it's like, oh man, like, look at this cool super supplement that has this great research on it, or look at this very complex strategy of doing this. And, it'll be the people that ask me like what the perfect ratio for intra workout is, as far as, should I have, should it be whey protein peptides, or should it be essential amino acids, or should it be this ratio, and how much leucine should be in there, and how much this and that. And I was like, that might maybe make a difference for someone, but it's certainly not you. And so from a nutrition standpoint, I mean, the same thing that even general population needs is the biggest barrier for people looking for advanced muscle building, which is something you could adhere to, period. There's some big stones that everybody seems to agree with research seems to support adequately as well too. I think looking at a protein goal is probably one of the most important things to start with. Is okay, what's my protein goal? And if you train hardish, 1 gram per pound of body weight seems to be a decent place to start. And if you train much harder, I mean, I've seen evidence that some people might need, 1.5 grams per pound, some people even 2 grams per pound. And the reality is at that point in time, it's like, well, there's not really any detriment to it. And then if it's like, well, do I train hard? Do I not train hard? It's like, well, if you actually train hard, experiment with that and see if it produces, any different benefit. But so people first and foremost need to have some idea, and protein is the stem into this. They have to have some idea of macronutrients. They have to have some idea of tracking. And I don't care what the hell you call it. I joke with that all the time. I do videos where you technically don't have to know what a macronutrient is. I mean, it makes it a little bit more difficult if you don't. But if you just do something consistently, so it's like, okay, one time look up how much protein's in a chicken breast. Okay, great. I've got to eat 3 pounds of chicken a day. Great. And then if you just kind of have this loose thing, it's like you don't ever have to always go and do the math again or whatever. You just need to know, okay, well, I'm going to eat 3 pounds of chicken a day. And like, oh, I need a little bit more protein. All right, I'm going to eat 3.5 pounds of chicken a day. Or I even joke with like, you could make your own measuring system. I'm like, I'm going to use this shovel that I found in my backyard, and this is my measuring for this. If you do something consistent and you don't change any variables, then if you need to change a variable, what did what, right? So it's like, okay, well, how do I know if more protein is going to help if I have no idea how much protein I'm eating every day? How much do I know if like I need more calories or I need more carbs or if I need less fat if I don't have any consistent baseline to actually compare back to? So that's it. And everybody gets lost in the weeds. I mean, I think the harder you train, I think there's a little bit more evidence to maybe having slightly more frequent meals. So if you're training really hard, and also just this notion of what's realistic and what can your digestion tolerate. Like if you need to eat 6,000 calories a day, 2 meals probably isn't going to do the job. Just again, because from what that will do to your digestive tract probably wouldn't be optimal. And then just realistically what you have to eat in sitting. But so for harder training individuals, I think there's evidence that says meal frequency is a good thing. So maybe, 3-4 meals is a baseline minimum. But as far as after that, there's the bodybuilding notion that you have to eat 6 meals a day or 7 meals a day or whatever. And I don't think there's really any evidence to support that at all. Not to say that that's wrong. I mean, if somebody enjoys that and they can do it consistently and it works for them, then that's obviously fine as well too. So, from a nutrition standpoint, again, I think everyone that always asks me these complex questions, I will literally be like, well, what are you doing right now? Where do you have it written down and what are you tracking? And it's normally like crickets after that point. It's the same people that say they can't lose weight are the same people that say they can't put on weight. And I'm like, well, how much are you eating? I eat a ton. All right. Or how little are you eating? I hardly eat anything. I was like, well, the last time I checked, those aren't actually, quantifiable metrics that you can track. And so it really just starts with doing something that you track in whatever way, shape, or form works best for you. You're consistent with it. You adhere to it. And then that way, if you need to make changes, you actually know what change is potentially doing what or not doing what. So hopefully that kind of answers your question of what you're looking for. Because again, I've never had somebody where, again, they tell me they're a hard gainer or they tell me whatever. And it's like, you're not a hard gainer. Like some people might technically have to eat more for their body weight, compared to someone else, the standard, the average or whatever. But that doesn't make you a hard gainer necessarily. It just means you have to maybe eat calorically more than someone else at a similar lean body tissue for whatever reason. But as soon as you find your point of where your maintenance is, and as soon as you start to structurally put over that point consistently, you'll start putting on weight. And I always tell people that too. When they say I'm a hard gainer, I can't put on tissue. It's like, that's not true. You're just not eating in a surplus. Because even if you didn't train hard and you were at least eating a surplus, you'd at least get fatter. And I'm like, well, look, there we go. Weight's going on. That might not be the goal, but look, a surplus has occurred. The scale is going up. And obviously the goal is to have a surplus where it adds to, more lean tissue. But that's it, man. It's relatively simple-ish stuff that people do. Like you said, they tend to overcomplicate it, and they don't want that. But man, like eating consistently every single day for weeks and months on end, that's really damn hard. It's like, yeah, it is really hard. I mean, to some degree. And that's why people don't want that secret. They don't want that secret to muscle building is, consistency and adherence is pretty much king for everybody, especially nutrition.
Yeah, no, 100%. And it's kind of like a little bit of the ADHD, like the training ADHD, where they're like, okay, well, I've done my workout and I ate my meals today. What else can I do? And it's just like,
yeah,
nope, just do that. You're fine.
Yeah.
And yeah, like you said, it just takes a long time, but you don't need a lot of these fancy things. Like, and admittedly, I'm also very skeptical of the degree of severity of the whole like non-responder thing.
Yeah.
I feel like that's more being used as a crutch than it is actually understood, because
Yeah.
very much like you, I've coached a lot of people who have been like, oh yeah, I just can't gain any weight. And I'm like, cool, then let's increase the calories. And I'll have to increase their calories by like 2,000 sometimes to
Yeah.
let them start gaining weight. And it's like,
Mhm.
there we go.
Yeah.
I had a 140-pound guy
Mhm.
who was eating like almost 3,000 calories before he started gaining any weight, which is
Yeah.
quite a bit.
Yep.
And but then at the end of the day, he started gaining weight and he ended up putting on like 17 pounds, and
Yeah.
it was pretty damn lean as well. Like, yeah, he probably gained
Mhm.
about, 3, 4 pounds, maybe 5 pounds of fat, but he was
Yeah.
still very lean, still had abs, things like that. And so I'm
Hmm.
really skeptical when people are like, oh, I can't gain weight. Cause it's like
Yeah.
you mentioned, we have an obesity epidemic. We don't have like a
Yeah.
fat epidemic.
Yeah.
So, and that obviously doesn't translate to muscle tissue, but at the end of the day,
Yeah.
a lot of that can be mediated by your sleep, by your stress, by your
Oh yeah.
actual training practices. So
Yep.
I'm pretty skeptical of those claims as well, because I've run into a lot of like quote unquote hard gainers, and then the moment we
Yeah.
start doing things like a little bit more intentionally, all of a sudden they start seeing the progress, and you're like, oh, weird. Wonder why
Yeah.
that's happening.
Yeah. Everyone gets too caught up on that. And it's kind of human nature.
Yeah,
Like, again, it's this balance of the discussions that, because people, it goes right in the same thread for me where people will be like, how do I know like if I have good genetics or bad genetics? Or it's like, well, what's the difference if
it's
someone's
like train for
enhanced or
20
not?
years and figure it out.
Yeah, exactly. And that, or like, well, and will this does this only work if someone's enhanced or using PDs or whatever? And I'm just like, I'll tell you the big secret with all of it is, of course, there are people that progress faster than others. But again, like you said, I've worked with so many people where, again, I've worked with so many people outside of the category. You work with females that are middle aged in their 50s or so or something. And it's like, well, all right, from a genetic standpoint, from a hormone standpoint, from where these people are at, these are not people to lay down significant amounts of tissue, and they can still lay down tissue because, and all that happens
Yeah,
is, again, yeah, of course, when I work with a 55-year-old woman, it happens a lot slower. It's not going to happen the same as some 20-year-old guy that's got great genetics that just touches a weight and gets big. So yes, it's fair to say that there are people that it happens easier, it happens faster, but that's the same as anything in the entire rest of the world. People pick up hobbies or jobs or, sports or classes or whatever quicker than others. And some people just have to work a little bit harder. So it really comes down to people when they say that, they're like, oh, I'm a non-responder, I'm a non-gainer. It's like, no, you're just not tracking close enough to see progress, or the progress you're seeing isn't what you want and you're impatient. So it's either
yeah,
people, they're not actually doing stuff accurately enough to actually realize they're making progress. Like I said, they just rather see it like, yeah, it'd be nice if it happened overnight, but that's just not the way that it works. So I think that's one of those things where, especially a non-responder or the hard gainer or whatever, there's a degree of accuracy of, yeah, it can be slower for some people, but if you're adhering to it, because that's really, I think, what stemmed a lot of stuff for me as a kid is everybody I trained with ever, all the way from high school through college, everybody got bigger and stronger faster than I did. And I just remember being like, what the hell, man? You don't realize it, first when you're 15 or 16, it just pisses you off. Like, this doesn't make any sense. Or no, you don't understand anything about muscle bellies or structure. And somebody's, they can bench the same as you, but their chest looks awesome. And, I don't have one. I'm like, what the hell's going on? I'm doing the exercise and we're doing the same stuff on paper. What the hell is going on? And, so it was from the fact that, okay, well, some people progress faster, do that stuff. It's like, am I just going to quit, or am I just going to maybe try and figure out a slightly better way? And then also be patient. Because that was the thing when I really was on top of my shit. And I was like, all right, well, I actually just have to pay attention to food. I actually have to get some sleep. And lo and behold, progress starts happening. It's like, all right, well, it might not happen as fast as I'd like or as fast as the next guy, but I can wait it out. Whatever. I'll take a couple pounds every single year. And, and at the end of the day, I think that's where a lot of people just, they're unwilling to do those things sometimes.
yeah. And so I like to kind of share my story sometimes with athletes when they kind of have a situation like that, because like, I mean, I'm strong, but I'm not anything crazy impressive. So like
Mm,
when I first started lifting weights, I was a boxer. I just retired, and then I transitioned into Olympic weightlifting.
mm,
I was 165 pounds and 183, 184 centimeters, so like
mm.
6'2" ish.
Yeah.
And I was weak as shit. Like there were plenty of women at my weightlifting club that were stronger than me, you know,
Yeah.
and like I just was not gifted for strength at all. And
Mm-hmm.
and I mean, here I am, like what, almost 10 years later. That was my first introduction to weights, but about 10 years later, now I weigh 280,
Mm-hmm.
and in the next, like, let's say 6 or 7 months, I'll squat over 700 raw. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, that's not a very impressive lift for someone my
Mm-hmm.
size. There's guys at
Mm-hmm.
180 pounds who are doing more than that.
Yeah.
But so even though I don't have great genetics for that sort of stuff, like, I'm way fucking stronger and I'm way bigger
Yeah.
than I ever thought I would be.
Yeah.
And I see guys who are like, they're like, oh, I've been working out for 6 months and I just pulled like 800 pounds. And I'm like, well, fuck you.
Yeah. Go
Like,
fuck yourself. Yeah.
and it's
Just so you
like,
know, I hate you. Okay. I've got that out of the
yeah,
way. Now we can carry on with the
yeah.
conversation.
And then there's, like, women, like, I don't know if you know who Hunter Henderson is, but
Mm-hmm.
man, that girl is a freak of nature. She is so
Yeah.
talented. And
Yeah.
you look at people like that and you're just like, okay, well, I clearly don't have the genetics for that. But
Yeah.
I think that you can go so much farther than people think.
Oh, for
And it just
sure. Yeah.
depends on, like, I mean, for me, I had to gain over 100 pounds, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just like, how much are you willing to do? How important is this to you? And like you said, the consistency,
Mm-hmm.
like, I mean, I still have a good 10 years left of lifting.
Yeah.
And I mean, where will I be? I don't know. Will I ever
Yeah.
squat 800 pounds, 900 pounds? I don't fucking know. But I mean, we'll find
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. Who
Right.
gives a shit? We'll find out. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
so I don't know. I think that if people just kind of stop, like you said, just trying to rush there, and
Yeah.
they're just like, it's like, do you enjoy this? Yes. Okay. Well,
Mm.
then just do it and shut up and
Yeah.
find happiness in some of the other things.
Yeah.
It's not always going to
Yeah.
be linear progress. Sometimes it's like,
Yeah.
my technique's getting better. Sometimes I'm recovering better. I look a little better. I'm not in as much pain because I'm training more
Yeah.
intelligently. Like,
Yeah.
going on hikes is easier, whatever it might be. So,
Yeah.
um, we're kind of coming up on almost the 90-minute mark. I wanted
Mhm.
to just see, is there anything that maybe you'd like to close with that you think is somewhat important that people should know?
No, I mean, I think what we were just touching on is probably one of the more important things. I mean, I always say, I think it goes for an individual person. It goes for coaches as well. I think one of the best thing a coach can do, and I think the most important thing a coach can do, which can translate to an individual. So if you're listening and you're not a coach, but is with your clients, is manage expectations. I always say, like, a coach's job is not to produce results. 99% of the time that should be the outcome, but a coach's job is to manage expectations. Because that's the thing too with, like, clients, is occasionally will have someone that's like, hey, here's all the things you need to do. And they're just like, meh. And it's like, well, all right, we can have some bigger conversations about life here. Like the same thing that you said. Sometimes I had clients before where I had a client that wants to come to me, a guy that wants to lose 50 pounds. He loses 40 pounds and then the last 10 pounds is sticky. When we're having conversations, he's like, well, I'm eating cleaner, but I like drinking beer a lot. And I drink beer on the weekends when I go golfing and I go out and eat and whatever. And I'm like, okay. And I was like, well, how important is, you doing that versus that 10 pounds? And he was like, well, it's really important. I want to keep doing that. I'm like, all right, great. Well, you're 40 pounds lighter than you were before. You're healthier than you were before. And now you just got maybe an extra 10 pounds you're not thrilled about, but you still get to be thrilled about drinking beer and doing shit or whatever. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff on that spectrum where I think, again, that kind of stuff hopefully fosters and supports whatever actions you're willing to do, and doesn't necessarily create these, doesn't make everything too outcome oriented, right? So with an athlete, again, it's like, obviously you want to know people, everyone can always get better. Everyone can always improve. And the only thing that you can do is focus on your actions. But again, not necessarily focus too much on that specific outcome, because whatever happens, happens. And it's a double-edged sword, because there's this balance. Like, you wouldn't want to say to people, like, I have people that want to get into bodybuilding and stuff sometimes. And the conversations that I have with people almost sounds like I'm trying to talk them out of it, but it's really just asking them the tough questions of, are they really into adhering to stuff for the right reason? Because, when Phil Heath first started lifting weights, he didn't know he was going to be Mr. Olympia. He didn't know that obviously his shit's going to respond and have this crazy genetics and all that kind of stuff necessarily. But so you wouldn't know if you're, Mr. Shit genetics or the next Mr. Olympia until you just get in the gym and start going. And if you end up being Mr. Shit genetics, then, you might just have something else that you're meant to do. But if you're action focused, and you just like that, you like the process, you like everything else, like you said, you can make yourself better, which is a win in and of itself. And then the great thing, again, obviously for a coaching world, it's the same with any coach in any sport in the world. it's like, well, if you're not necessarily gifted and you have to think a little bit more and you have to work a little bit harder and you have to be a little bit more aware of what you're doing, there's a much larger population of people that are in your boat, in your same shoes that you can help, as opposed to people that are, Phil Heath. Phil Heath has never asked me to help him with arm training. And no one with genetics like Phil Heath for arms is ever going to ask for help for arm training. So the reality is, should Phil Heath be telling anyone how to train arms? I don't know. He tells people how he trains arms, which is fine, but I think that's going to have that same outcome, may or may not benefit pretty much anyone. So I guess that would be, that would be the big thing. Kind of like we touched on right from that to this is just, if you, stay action focused, and then just be realistic with whatever the outcome is. And kind of like you said, make your peace with that to a certain degree and just be happy with progress, be happy with benefit, whatever it is. And because like I said, the same thing, it's funny hearing you talk about the same stuff. It's depending on who you're talking to, people think you're weird because you tell somebody that you're not that strong. That's like a normal person in the grocery store. And they're like, are you trying to be like false modesty here or something or whatever? It's like, well, no, if you see the people I hate, because I tell people all the time, it's like some people, when I talk to normal people, they'll say something about being big and I'll joke, I'm like, oh, I'm not big. And they're like, what are you talking about? And I was like, oh, well, like the people I hang out with, like those people are big. And then it's the funny part, like you said, you'll have people like, the way things are with social media, people are like, man, are like, do you even like lift compared? I'm like, I'm literally standing next to potentially one of the 5 biggest human beings on the planet from a bodybuilding standpoint. I'm like, I should look small compared to that person. And that's the joke. I mean, because some of it, I'm sure the same as you. I mean, it's you're forever going to be maybe perma weak in your brain, where it's just like, obviously it's like, I technically feel perma small forever. Like, yeah, I'd like to be like 300 pounds, but at the same time, there's a balance of what I think is realistic. And I can still actually be happy with where I'm at right now. But that perma small is kind of in my brain forever. So it's like, yeah, like I get it. But at the same time, the funny thing is because of the way the world is, like I'll be on social media and I'll meet someone in person that follows my stuff. And they're like, man, you're way bigger than I thought you were. And I was like, I'm not, standing next to whoever that weighs 300 pounds right now or whatever. So it's all kind of perspective on that stuff as well too. Like, and the same thing you said, I would have never thought in a million years, like my whole goal training, like I think it took me a solid 5 or 6 years to even look like I worked out. Like that was my first goal. I want people to know that I actually work out. And, so to get to a point where I actually, I like the way that I look. I'm happy with where I'm at right now. I wouldn't have thought, the same thing if I could at 15 see myself now. And I'm like, oh, holy shit, that's great, man. I would have never thought that was possible. So, it's the same thing. It's like, you got to have those things for yourself. You just kind of have realistic, all right, I'm not meant to be Mr. Olympia, but I can certainly be a better version of myself, which is still pretty damn awesome. And I can help people do the same thing. So I don't know if that's a very concise, epic thing to finish on there, but I think it is, again, if people just kind of take a step back a little bit and are just kind of realistic with where they're at. And again, just, man, it's cliche, but love that process, enjoy the training and enjoy any benefit that comes, regardless of the exact metric of how much that benefit may or may not be, No,
I think that was a great way to kind of end the episode on. So where can people find you?
So, I do most of my free content now. I'm actually pretty hard on 2 platforms. So on Instagram, it's just Hypertrophy Coach, which is just spelled Hypertrophy Coach. And so I'm pretty much daily. We're just putting out some content there. My YouTube page, I've been very consistent with a few videos a week now. It's something I'm trying to put out more consistently there. So good stuff there. And so those are good places I say to start. And if you like my stuff, I have an app that I do. So it's, through hypertrophycoach.com, or if you just search Hypertrophy Coach in any of the App Store, Google Play, all that. And it's basically just way more detail of everything that I give out for free. So it's my thing now is based on, has, a lot of complete programs people can follow on it, and literally just like hundreds and hundreds of hours of educational content, forums. I'm on there every single day answering questions and stuff like that. So that's, I always say, start with dip your toes in with Instagram and YouTube, see if it's your cup of tea. And then again, for people that are really into it, that's the whole point of the app, is just another level of, how deep I go with some of the content.
Awesome. So all that stuff's going to be linked up in the show notes, guys. Definitely make sure you go give them a follow on YouTube and Instagram, and check out the app if you want to get jacked. Joe, man, it was an awesome conversation. I'm really glad we were able to make this happen, man. Thanks so much for joining on.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Happy to be here.